The copper coins clinked softly against each other as Zelda Jensen's trembling fingers counted them one more time, hoping somehow the number would change. But 7 remained 7 no matter how desperately she wished otherwise. The general store in Montana City. Montana smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and the afternoon sun of June 1878 filtered through the dusty windows, catching the concern etched across the shopkeeper's weathered face as he watched her realize she did not have enough to cover the flour, beans, and medicine she had already placed on the counter. "I am so sorry, Mr. Henderson," Zelda said, her voice barely above a whisper as heat crept up her neck. She started to reach for the items to put them back, her stomach twisting with humiliation. At 22 years old, she had known hunger before, but this felt different somehow, more final. Her father had died 3 months ago from pneumonia, leaving her alone on a failing homestead 5 miles outside town with nothing but debts and dried-up wells. "Now hold on there, miss," a deep voice said from behind her, and she turned to see a tall cowboy in dust-covered clothes stepping forward from where he had been examining rope near the back wall. He wore a tan Stetson that shadowed eyes the color of storm clouds, and stubble darkened his strong jaw. Without asking permission or even looking directly at her, he pulled out a leather wallet and counted out bills onto the counter. That should cover her purchases and then some. "Sir, I cannot accept," Zelda protested, reaching out as if to stop him, but he was already moving toward the door, his spurs jangling with each long stride. "Already done," he said over his shoulder, and then he was gone, disappearing into the bright Montana afternoon like a ghost, leaving Zelda standing there with her mouth open and her heart hammering against her ribs. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began wrapping her items in brown paper. "That was Frank Calloway. Good man. Works the Triple Bar Ranch north of here. Does not talk much, but he has got a decent heart under all that trail dust." Zelda could barely concentrate on his words. Her mind spun with questions, and something else she could not quite name. Something warm and unsettling that had sparked to life when those gray eyes had flickered across her face for just a moment before he turned away. She gathered her packages with numb fingers, thanked Mr. Henderson, and stepped out into the dusty street where wagons rolled past and men on horseback navigated around pedestrians. She looked left and right, searching for the mysterious cowboy, but he had vanished completely into the bustle of the growing town. Montana City had swelled in recent years with miners, ranchers, and railroad workers, and the main street stretched long with saloons, hotels, a bank, and various shops. Somewhere in that crowd was the man who had just saved her from complete embarrassment, and she did not even get the chance to properly thank him. The walk back to her homestead took over an hour in the heat, and by the time she reached the small cabin with its sagging porch and weed-choked garden, sweat had soaked through her faded calico dress. She set the packages on the rough wooden table her father had built and sank into a chair, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her situation. The coins he had given back as change sat in her pocket, more money than she had seen in weeks, but it would not last. She needed work, needed a way to survive that did not depend on the charity of strangers, no matter how kindly meant. That night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the wind whistle through gaps in the cabin walls, Zelda made a decision. She would find Frank Calloway and repay him every cent, and then she would figure out how to stand on her own 2 feet the way her father had taught her. She might be alone now, but she was not helpless. The next morning she rose before dawn and dressed in her only other decent dress, a dark blue cotton that had been her mother's before fever took her when Zelda was 16. She braided her honey-colored hair, pinned it up, and set out for town again, this time with purpose hardening her spine. If Frank Calloway worked at the Triple Bar Ranch, someone in town would know how to reach him. She tried the bank first, where the clerk gave her a suspicious look and said he could not share information about customers. The land office proved equally unhelpful, but the woman at the boarding house, Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, took pity on her when Zelda explained she needed to repay a debt. "The Triple Bar boys come into town most Saturday nights," Mrs. Whitmore said, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a round woman with kind eyes and gray streaking through her brown hair. "They drink at the Silver Dollar Saloon usually, but if you are looking to settle accounts, you could ride out to the ranch itself. It is about 10 miles north, follows the creek road most of the way." "I do not have a horse anymore," Zelda admitted. She had sold their only mare last month to pay for her father's burial. Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I've got a mule that needs exercising anyway. You can borrow her if you promise to bring her back by nightfall." "I cannot spare her longer than that." Gratitude welled up so strong that Zelda's eyes burned. "Thank you. I promise I will take good care of her." The mule turned out to be a stubborn gray creature named Betsy who had opinions about everything, but she moved steadily enough once convinced of the direction. Zelda followed the creek road as instructed, watching the landscape change from dry grassland to rolling hills dotted with cattle. The morning sun climbed higher, and she was grateful for her bonnet shielding her face from its intensity. The Triple Bar Ranch appeared as a collection of buildings in a shallow valley: a main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, and several corrals where horses milled about. As she rode closer, men stopped their work to watch her approach, and she felt the weight of their curious stares. A dog barked, and chickens scattered from the mule's path. An older man with a silver mustache stepped down from the porch of the main house, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Can I help you, miss? I am looking for Frank Calloway," Zelda said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have business with him." "Frank?" The man hollered toward the barn without taking his eyes off her. "You got a visitor." A figure emerged from the barn's shadows, and even from a distance, Zelda recognized the breadth of his shoulders and the way he moved with unconscious grace. Frank Calloway walked toward her with his hat tilted back, and in the full light of day, she could see him more clearly. He had to be around 25, with tanned skin and a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Surprise registered on his face when he recognized her, followed quickly by something more guarded. "Miss Jensen," he said, his voice even deeper than she remembered. "Did not expect to see you out here." She slid down from the mule, and her legs wobbled slightly from the long ride. "I came to repay you, Mr. Calloway. What you did yesterday was generous, but I cannot accept charity." He studied her for a moment, and she noticed his eyes were not just gray but had flecks of blue in them like storm clouds breaking apart. It was not charity, it was just the right thing to do. Nevertheless, she pulled out the money she had carefully counted, holding it out to him. "I insist." The older man chuckled from the porch. "She has got grit, Frank. I like her already." "This is Mr. Theodore Burke, the ranch owner," Frank said, ignoring the money in her outstretched hand. "And miss, I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot take it back." "Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. Pay it forward when you are able." "I would prefer to settle it now," Zelda insisted, frustration creeping into her voice. "I do not like being in debt." "Then work it off," Mr. Burke suggested, descending the porch steps with a slight limp. "We need someone who can cook for the hands. Our last cook quit after the boys complained about his biscuits one too many times. You any good in a kitchen?" The question caught Zelda completely off guard. "I can cook, yes. My mother taught me before she passed." "Then it is settled," Mr. Burke said with the air of a man used to making decisions quickly. You work here for a few weeks, cook 3 meals a day for about a dozen men, and your debt to Frank is paid. We will pay you wages on top of that. You can stay in the small cabin out back. It is not fancy, but it has a good roof and a stove. Zelda's mind raced. Leave her homestead. But for what? The land was failing, the well was dry, and she had no money to hire help or buy seed. This could be the answer to prayers she had been too proud to say out loud. Still, she hesitated. I would need to think about it. Fair enough, Mr. Burke said, but we need an answer soon. The boys are getting restless with poor food. Frank had been silent during this exchange, his expression unreadable. Now he spoke quietly. It is honest work, Miss Jensen. Mr. Burke treats his people fair. Something in his tone, a gentleness she had not expected, made her decision easier. I will do it, but I need a day to gather my things and secure my cabin. Frank can help you with that, Mr. Burke said before Frank could protest. Take the wagon tomorrow, son. Help the lady move her necessaries. A muscle ticked in Frank's jaw, but he nodded. Yes, sir. I will come by your place around midday tomorrow, Miss Jensen. The ride back to town on the borrowed mule felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. By the time she returned Betsy to Mrs. Whitmore and explained what had happened, the older woman was nodding approval. The triple bar is a good outfit, Mrs. Whitmore said. You will be safe there, and Lord knows you need the work. As for your cabin, I know a family looking for land to sharecrop. I can put them in touch if you like. Everything was moving so fast that Zelda barely had time to process it all, but she agreed, grateful for the help. She spent that night at the boarding house since it was too late to walk home, lying awake in a rented room and wondering what she had just committed herself to. Working on a ranch full of men, living in a cabin on their property, seeing Frank Calloway every day. The last thought sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach that she firmly told herself was just nerves. The next day, Frank arrived at her homestead precisely at noon, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 bay horses. Zelda had spent the morning packing her few belongings into crates and sacks, trying not to look at the places where her father's presence still lingered, like the chair he had always sat in by the fireplace, or the coat still hanging by the door. Frank climbed down from the wagon and removed his hat when he approached, a gesture of respect that touched her more than it probably should have. Morning, Miss Jensen. I brought extra rope for securing your things. Thank you, she said, suddenly shy in a way she had not been at the ranch with others around. I do not have much. It should not take long. They worked in companionable silence, Frank lifting the heavier items with ease and arranging them carefully in the wagon bed. When he picked up a small trunk, she warned him it held her mother's dishes, and he handled it with such care that her throat tightened. You are good at this, she said, needing to break the silence that had stretched too long. He glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Loading wagons. Being kind, helping people. She looked away, embarrassed by her own boldness. Why did you pay for my things at the store? You did not know me. Frank was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Finally, he said, I know what it is like to count coins and come up short. Someone helped me once when I needed it. Figured I should do the same when I could. Where are you from originally? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Texas, mostly. Came up here after the war. He did not elaborate, and something in his tone suggested he did not want to. What about you? Born in Ohio. My parents brought me west when I was 10, looking for a fresh start. She smiled sadly. They found hardship instead, but they never complained. My father always said Montana was the most beautiful place on earth, even when the land fought him at every turn. Frank nodded slowly. It is hard country, takes a certain kind of person to love it. Do you love it, I mean? He looked out at the rolling hills, the vast sky, the mountains visible in the distant west. "Yeah, I reckon I do. It is honest, at least. Does not pretend to be something it is not." They finished loading as the sun reached its peak, and Zelda took one last walk through the empty cabin, saying goodbye to the only home she had known for 12 years. She locked the door and tucked the key in her pocket, then climbed up to the wagon seat where Frank waited. The ride to the Triple Bar took most of the afternoon, and as they traveled, Frank pointed out landmarks and told her about the ranch. He had worked there for 3 years, saved most of his wages, and planned to buy his own land someday. He spoke matter-of-factly about hard winters and drought summers, rustlers and wolves, but also about the satisfaction of working with cattle and horses, of building something with his own hands. Zelda found herself relaxing in his presence, surprised by how easy he was to talk to once he opened up a little. He asked about her cooking, and she told him about her mother's recipes, the ones she had memorized and could make in her sleep. He actually smiled when she described her father's reaction the first time she made rabbit stew on her own at age 13. "Bet it was good," Frank said. "It was terrible. I forgot to add salt and overcooked the meat until it was like leather, but he ate every bite and told me it was delicious." Her eyes stung with the memory. He was a good man. Sounds like it. When they arrived at the ranch, several of the hands helped unload her belongings into the small cabin Mr. Burke had mentioned. It was indeed simple. Just one room with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and some shelves, but it was clean and the roof looked sound. Someone had even left fresh linens on the bed and a few supplies in the cupboard. "Mr. Burke's orders," Frank explained when she exclaimed over the kindness. "He wants you comfortable." The cookhouse was a separate building near the bunkhouse with a large wood stove, a long table, and good workspace. Zelda explored it while Frank carried in the last of her things, her mind already planning menus. She could do this. She could make it work. That evening, she cooked her first meal for the ranch hands, a simple affair of steak, potatoes, gravy, and biscuits. The men filed in with obvious skepticism, but the skepticism turned to appreciation after the first bites. Compliments flew across the table, and Mr. Burke winked at her from his seat at the head. Frank ate quietly, but when he brought his empty plate to her afterward, he said, "Best meal I have had in months, Miss Jensen. Thank you." The warmth in his voice did strange things to her heartbeat. "You are welcome, Mr. Calloway. You can call me Frank. We are not formal around here. Then you should call me Zelda." He nodded, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of a barrier crossed. Then he settled his hat back on his head and headed out into the dusk, leaving her to clean up and wonder why she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Zelda rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, served it to hungry men who quickly learned to show up on time or miss out, then spent her mornings preparing lunch and doing the endless dishes. Afternoons were for supper preparations and occasional baking, and she fell into bed, each night exhausted but satisfied in a way she had not felt since her father got sick. Frank became a regular presence in her peripheral vision. He always thanked her for meals, sometimes helped carry heavy pots or fetch water when he noticed her struggling, and occasionally lingered after the other men left to ask if she needed anything. Their conversations remained brief and practical, but Zelda found herself looking forward to them more than she wanted to admit. 2 weeks into her tenure at the Triple Bar, a commotion erupted in the yard during lunch. Zelda rushed to the window to see several men on horseback arguing with Mr. Burke, their voices raised and angry. Frank appeared from somewhere, stepping between his boss and the strangers with his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "What is going on?" Zelda asked one of the hands who had stayed inside. Trouble with the Rockingham Ranch, the young man named Samuel explained. They are claiming our cattle crossed onto their land and damaged some fences. Mr. Burke says it is nonsense, but they have been looking for a fight all summer. Zelda watched through the window as Frank spoke calmly to the angry visitors, his posture relaxed but ready. Whatever he said seemed to diffuse the situation, because the strangers eventually wheeled their horses around and rode off, though not without some choice words shouted over their shoulders. Frank came in for his lunch late, and Zelda noticed his jaw was tight with tension. She fixed him a plate without being asked and set it in front of him at the table. "Thank you," he said, then added, "Sorry about the disturbance. Are they going to cause more problems?" She sat across from him, forgetting her usual practice of staying in the kitchen while the men ate. Probably. The Rockingham owner, Jack Hendricks, has been trying to expand his territory for years. He sees Mr. Burke as competition. Frank took a bite of his food, chewed thoughtfully. "It will work itself out. You are not worried." He looked at her directly, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I worry about a lot of things, Zelda, but I try not to borrow trouble before it arrives. What do you worry about?" The question was too personal, too intimate for their barely formed friendship, but she could not take it back. Frank set down his fork, considering. "I worry about the people who depend on this ranch. I worry about dry years and hard winters. I worry that I will not save enough to buy my own place before I get too old to work it properly." He paused, then added quietly, "I worry about people getting hurt when I could have prevented it. Is that why you stepped in front of Mr. Burke today? Someone had to. You could have been shot, but I was not." He picked up his fork again, signaling the end of the conversation, but Zelda could not let it go. "Does your family know you take such risks? Do they worry about you?" Something shuddered in his expression. "I do not have family anymore. Lost my parents and sister to fever back in Texas before I came north. It is just me now." The pain in those simple words resonated with her own grief. "I am sorry. I know what it is like to be alone." "You do, don't you?" His voice softened. "But you are managing it better than most would. You have got strength, Zelda Jensen." Heat crept up her neck at the compliment. "I am just doing what I have to do, same as anyone." "No, not same as anyone. A lot of people would have given up by now, but you are still fighting. That takes courage." Before she could respond, other men started filtering back in for coffee and dessert, and the moment passed. But that night, lying in her small cabin and replaying the conversation, Zelda admitted to herself what she had been trying to ignore for weeks. She was developing feelings for Frank Calloway, feelings that went far beyond gratitude or simple attraction. She liked the way he moved through the world with quiet confidence, the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station, the way he looked at her sometimes as if she was something precious he was afraid to break. It was dangerous, letting herself feel this way. She worked for Mr. Burke, and getting involved with one of the hands could complicate everything. More than that, she barely knew Frank despite their conversations. What if he did not feel the same? What if she was reading kindness as something more? But the heart, she was learning, did not always listen to logic. The trouble with the Rockingham escalated over the following weeks. Fences were cut, cattle went missing, and one of the triple bar hands got roughed up in town by Rockingham men. Mr. Burke rode into Montana City to speak with the sheriff, but law enforcement was stretched thin in this part of Montana. And unless someone was killed, the authorities showed little interest in rancher disputes. Frank became quieter and more watchful during this time, often riding the fence lines late into the evening and checking the herds multiple times a day. Zelda worried about him, though she tried to hide it. She started saving back extra food from supper, so he would have something warm when he came in late. and she made sure there was always fresh coffee in the cookhouse. One night in late July, he appeared at her cabin door well after dark, his hat in his hands and exhaustion written in every line of his body. "I saw your lamp still on. Did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," she said, stepping back to let him in. "I was just mending some dish towels. Are you hungry? I have stew left over." "I could eat," he admitted, and she bustled around heating the stew and slicing bread, grateful for something to do with her hands while her heart raced at his presence in her small space. He ate standing up, too tired or restless to sit, and she watched him with concern. "You are working too hard, Frank. You need rest." "Cannot rest when there is trouble brewing." He set his empty bowl down and met her eyes. "There is talk of a big confrontation coming." Hendricks is running out of patience with what he calls Mr. Burke's stubbornness. Fear shot through her. "What kind of confrontation?" "The kind where men get hurt." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I am trying to find a way to prevent it, but I am not sure there is one. Some men are just set on destruction." Without thinking, Zelda crossed the space between them and touched his arm. "Please be careful. I could not bear it if something happened to you." The words hung in the air between them, too revealing, too honest. Frank looked down at her hand on his arm, then slowly covered it with his own. His palm was warm and calloused, and the touch sent electricity racing up her arm. "Zelda," he said, and her name in his rough voice was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. "I need to tell you something. I have been trying to keep it professional, but I am not very good at lying to myself." "What is it?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Ever since that day in the general store, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. The way you held your head high even when you were embarrassed, the strength it took to ride out here and insist on repaying me, the way you have made this place feel more like home than it ever has before." He turned his hand so their fingers intertwined. "I know I have got no right to say these things. You work here, and I am just a cowhand with nothing but a few saved dollars to my name, but I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel." Joy and fear warred in her chest. "What do you feel, Frank?" "Like I have been wandering in the dark and finally found a light, like maybe all the hard years were leading me here to you." He lifted his free hand and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with heartbreaking gentleness. "I am falling for you, Zelda Jensen, maybe already fallen. And I will understand if you do not feel the same, if I am reading this all wrong, but I had to tell you. Life is too short and too uncertain to keep silent about something this important." Tears pricked her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You are not reading it wrong. I feel it too, Frank. I have been trying to be sensible, but my heart has other ideas." The smile that broke across his face transformed him, made him look younger and lighter. "Yeah, yeah," she confirmed, laughing through her tears. He pulled her close, and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest where she could hear his heart hammering as hard as hers. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and for the first time since her father died, Zelda felt truly safe. They stood that way for a long time, neither wanting to break the moment. Finally, Frank pulled back just enough to look down at her. "I should let you get some sleep. It is late." "I do not want you to go," she admitted. "I do not want to go either, but I want to do this right. Court you properly, let people get used to the idea. Is that okay?" The old-fashioned consideration made her smile. "That is more than okay." He kissed her forehead, a sweet press of lips that promised more to come, then stepped back reluctantly. "Good night, Zelda, sleep well." "Good night, Frank." After he left, she touched her forehead where his lips had been and allowed herself to simply feel happy, even knowing the troubles ahead. For tonight, this was enough. The courting that followed was conducted under the interested eyes of the entire ranch. Frank made no secret of his intentions, and Zelda stopped trying to hide her feelings. He found excuses to help her in the cookhouse, and she started packing him extra food for his long days. On Sunday afternoons, when work eased up, they walked together along the creek, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams. Zelda learned that Frank had fought briefly in the war at the tail end, that he had drifted for years afterward trying to find his place, that he loved horses more than cattle but appreciated both. He wanted land with good water and grass, a place to build something lasting. He read when he could get his hands on books, preferring histories and adventure stories. He had a scar on his shoulder from a bull that tried to gore him and another on his hand from a rope burn gone bad. Frank learned that Zelda had wanted to be a teacher before her mother died and she became responsible for the household. She loved thunderstorms and hated snakes. She missed her parents every day but was learning to carry the grief without letting it crush her. She dreamed of having a garden again, a big one with vegetables and flowers. She could play piano, though she had not touched one in years. She was afraid of deep water because she had nearly drowned in a river crossing as a child. They shared first kisses by the creek under a sky full of stars, sweet and tentative and perfect. They held hands when they thought no one was looking and found reasons to stand close when they worked side by side. The other ranch hands teased them good-naturedly, but Mr. Burke just smiled knowingly and said nothing. In late August, the trouble with the rocking M came to a head. Hendricks rode onto Triple Bar land with a dozen armed men, claiming that Mr. Burke owed him for damages and trespassing. Mr. Burke met them in the yard with Frank and several other hands backing him up, and Zelda watched from the cookhouse window with her heart in her throat. Angry words were exchanged, threats made, and then someone from the rocking M drew a gun. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Frank threw himself in front of Mr. Burke just as the shot rang out, and Zelda screamed without realizing it. Frank went down, and the yard erupted in chaos. She ran outside without thinking, pushing past shouting men and frightened horses to reach Frank where he lay on the ground. Blood stained his shirt, but he was conscious, his face twisted with pain. "Frank!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound in his shoulder. "You are going to be fine. You hear me? You are going to be fine." "Zelda," he gritted out. "You should not be out here. It is not safe." "I do not care." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Someone get a doctor." The Rocking M men had fled at the first sight of blood, apparently not having bargained for actual violence, and the Triple Bar hands were already pursuing them. Mr. Burke knelt on Frank's other side, his face grim. "We will get you fixed up, son. You just hang on." They carried Frank into the main house, and Zelda refused to leave his side despite Mr. Burke's gentle suggestions that she should. The doctor, when he finally arrived from town 2 hours later, was a gruff older man who examined the wound and declared it serious but not fatal. "Bullet went clean through. Missed anything vital by pure luck. He will be down for a few weeks, but he should recover fully if infection does not set in." The doctor cleaned and bandaged the wound while Frank gritted his teeth against the pain, refusing the whiskey offered for its numbing properties. Zelda held his hand through it all, and Frank clung to her like a lifeline. When the doctor finally left with instructions for care, she settled in a chair beside the bed where they had installed Frank and prepared to keep watch. "You do not have to stay," Frank said, his voice weak. "You have got work to do. The work can wait. I am staying right here." She squeezed his hand. "You jumped in front of a bullet for Mr. Burke. You could have died. Could not let him get shot. He has done too much for me. And what about you? What about us?" The words came out fiercer than she intended. "Did you think about that before you played hero?" He looked at her with tired eyes. I thought about it, but I also thought about what kind of man I would be if I let my boss take a bullet when I could stop it. Would you still want me if I was a coward? Her anger deflated. You are not a coward. You are reckless and brave and infuriating. But you still want me, more than ever, you fool. A weak smile crossed his face. Good, because I am going to need someone to fuss over me while I heal, and you are very good at fussing. Despite everything, she laughed. I suppose I am. The days that followed were tense. The sheriff finally got involved after the shooting, and there was talk of arresting the Rockingham hand who fired the shot, but he had fled the territory. Hendricks himself claimed ignorance of his employees' intentions and paid a fine for trespassing. It was not justice, but it was enough to ease the immediate tensions. Zelda split her time between the cookhouse and Frank's bedside, often preparing food that she could eat with him while he recovered. The other hands took turns helping with chores they knew Frank would usually do, and Mr. Burke hired a temporary hand to pick up the slack. As Frank healed, he grew restless with inactivity. Zelda scolded him whenever she caught him trying to do too much, and their arguments became a source of entertainment for the rest of the ranch. But underneath, the bickering was deep affection, and everyone could see it. One evening in early September, when Frank was finally allowed to sit up and move around a little, he asked Zelda to take a walk with him. They moved slowly, Frank favoring his injured shoulder, and ended up by the creek where they had shared so many conversations. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air had started to carry the first hints of autumn's coolness. Frank stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. I have been doing a lot of thinking while I have been laid up, he said. About life and what matters and what I want my future to look like. Zelda's heart started to race. What did you decide? That I do not want to wait anymore. I have saved enough for a down payment on some land north of here, good land with water and grass. Mr. Burke knows about it and has agreed to help me work it until I can build it up. It is not much yet, but it could be something with time and hard work. He took both her hands in his. What I am trying to say, probably badly, is that I want to build a life with you, Zelda. I want to marry you and start a ranch and make all those dreams we have talked about come true together. Joy flooded through her so powerfully she could barely breathe. Are you asking me to marry you, Frank Calloway? I am. I know I should wait longer, court you properly for a year like people expect, but nearly dying made me realize I do not want to waste any more time. Life is too short and too precious. He pulled a small ring from his pocket, nothing fancy, just a simple gold band but beautiful in its simplicity. This was my mother's. It is all I have left from my family, and I want you to have it. Will you marry me, Zelda? Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he kissed her, and despite his injury, despite the fading light and the cool breeze, it was the warmest moment of her life. They married in October in a small ceremony at the church in Montana City. Mr. Burke stood up as Frank's witness, and Mrs. Whitmore served as Zelda's. The ranch hands attended, along with various townspeople who had gotten to know them both. It was simple and perfect, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zelda felt her heart might burst with happiness. Mr. Burke threw them a party at the ranch, complete with a fiddler and dancing and more food than 20 people could eat. Zelda wore a dress borrowed from Mrs. Whitmore, altered to fit, and Frank wore his Sunday best with his arm still in a sling from his injury. They danced carefully, mindful of his healing shoulder, and laughed when he spun her too fast and nearly lost his balance. As the party wound down and the stars came out, Frank took her to see the land he had bought. It was a beautiful piece of property with a creek running through it and views of the mountains. A small cabin already stood there, built by the previous owner who had given up and gone back east. "It needs work," Frank admitted as they stood hand in hand looking at their new home. "But I figure we can fix it up together. Maybe add on a room or two when we need them." "When we need them," Zelda smiled up at him. "You are already planning for children. Is that all right? I always wanted a family." "Never thought I would get the chance after losing mine, but now," he pulled her close, "now I can see it all so clearly. You and me and a bunch of kids running around, building something that will last." "That sounds perfect," she whispered. They spent their wedding night in that small cabin, and despite its rough walls and simple furnishings, it felt like a palace. Frank was gentle with her, patient and loving, and Zelda marveled at how right everything felt, how being with him was like coming home to a place she had never been but always belonged. The next months were filled with hard work and deep satisfaction. They continued working for Mr. Burke while slowly improving their own land, fixing fences, repairing the cabin, and planning for the spring when they could start building their own herd. Frank's shoulder healed completely, and Zelda discovered she was pregnant in December, just before the first major snow. Frank's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down gently and pressed his hand to her still flat stomach with wonder in his eyes. "A baby," he said softly. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the answer obvious. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," he kissed her tenderly. "You have given me everything, Zelda. A home, a purpose, a future, and now a child. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of you." "You already are," she assured him. Winter in Montana was brutal that year, with heavy snows and temperatures that plunged below zero. Frank insisted they stay in the bunkhouse cabin at the Triple Bar rather than risk being snowed in at their own place, and Zelda was grateful for the company and warmth. She continued cooking for the ranch until her pregnancy made standing for long hours difficult, and then Mr. Burke hired a replacement and told her to rest. The baby came in late July of 1879 during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and lit up the sky. Mrs. Whitmore attended as midwife, and Frank paced outside the cabin until the sound of a baby's cry brought him running back in. "A boy," Mrs. Whitmore announced, handing Frank his son wrapped in a clean blanket. "Healthy and strong, just like his father." Frank looked down at the tiny face with an expression of such awe that Zelda's heart swelled even more than she thought possible. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James Theodore Calloway after both their fathers, and he became the center of their world. Frank proved to be a devoted father, helping with night feedings and diaper changes without complaint, and playing with James whenever he had a spare moment. By the time James was a year old, they had built up enough of their own herd to move to their land permanently. Mr. Burke helped them build a larger house, a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms and a big kitchen where Zelda could cook and bake to her heart's content. They planted the garden she had dreamed of, and she taught James to dig in the dirt and identify different vegetables. The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep contentment. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Margaret Jane in 1881 and another son, William Francis, in 1884. The ranch prospered slowly but surely, and Frank's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher grew. Zelda sometimes thought back to that day in the general store, counting her last 7 coins and feeling like the world was ending. If someone had told her then that the dusty cowboy who paid her tab would become her husband, the father of her children and the love of her life, she would not have believed them. But that was exactly what happened, and she was grateful every single day. The children grew healthy and strong. James inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He loved working with the horses and spent hours following Frank around, learning everything he could about ranching. Margaret was spirited and clever, always asking questions and wanting to know how things worked. William was still young but showed signs of being the most adventurous of the three, constantly getting into mischief and making his parents laugh. In 1886, when James was 7, Margaret 5, and William 2, the Calloway ranch faced its biggest challenge yet. A harsh winter killed off a portion of their herd, and they struggled to recover financially. Zelda and Frank sat at their kitchen table night after night, going over accounts and trying to figure out how to make it through. "We might need to sell some land," Frank said reluctantly. "Just enough to cover our debts and buy feed for the remaining cattle." "Or," Zelda countered, "we could use my inheritance." Frank looked up sharply. "What inheritance?" "I never told you because it did not seem important. When my father died, he had a small life insurance policy. It was not much, and I have kept it saved for emergencies." She pulled out a bank book from the desk drawer. "This qualifies as an emergency." Frank stared at the numbers in the book, then at his wife. "You have had this money all along and never said anything. It was for our children's future." "But what kind of future will they have if we lose the ranch?" She took his hands. "We are partners in this, Frank. What is mine is yours. We use this money to get through, and we pay it back to ourselves when times are better." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You paid for my groceries when I was counting my last 7 coins," she said with a smile. "Best investment you ever made." They used the money wisely, and by spring, the ranch was stabilizing. Frank worked harder than ever, and Zelda managed the household accounts with careful precision. The children pitched in as they were able, and slowly, surely, they rebuilt what they had lost. By 1890, the ranch was thriving again. They had expanded their land holdings, built a bigger barn, and employed 3 full-time hands. James, now 11, was already doing a man's work, and Frank could not have been prouder. Margaret had developed a talent for healing animals and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, though such things were rare for women. William was still young but showed promise as a natural horseman. Zelda stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Frank came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. How far we have come, how lucky we are." She leaned back against him. "Do you ever think about that day in the store?" "All the time," he admitted. "Best day of my life, even if I did not know it then." "Mine too." She turned in his arms to face him. "I was so scared that day. I thought I had reached the end of everything, but it was really just the beginning." "The beginning of us," he agreed, and kissed her as the sun dipped below the horizon. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and challenges. In 1893, they welcomed their 4th child, a daughter named Sarah Rose. The 3 older children doted on their baby sister, and Zelda marveled at how her family had grown from those lonely days after her father's death. James grew into a fine young man, responsible and hardworking. At 18, he started courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and Zelda saw in his eyes the same look Frank had once given her. Margaret, now 16, had become an invaluable help around the ranch, particularly with sick or injured animals. Her skill was so renowned that people from neighboring ranches started bringing her their animals to treat. William, at 14, was already making plans to explore the wider world, talking about seeing the ocean and big cities, though Frank hoped he would eventually settle down on the land. Sarah, at 6, was the joy of everyone's life, sweet-natured and curious. Frank's hair had started to gray at the temples, and Zelda noticed lines around his eyes that had not been there when they married. But to her, he was as handsome as ever. Their love had deepened over the years, maturing from passionate romance into something more profound, a partnership built on respect, trust, and shared dreams. In the summer of 1899, James married his sweetheart in a ceremony that reminded Zelda so much of her own wedding that she cried through the entire thing. Frank squeezed her hand and whispered that their son had chosen well, and she agreed. The young couple built a house on Calloway land, and James took over more and more of the ranch operations as Frank started to step back. Margaret, at 22, shocked everyone by announcing she had been accepted to a veterinary program in Chicago. It was almost unheard of for a woman, but she had impressed the right people with her knowledge and skill. Though it broke Zelda's heart to see her daughter leave, she and Frank supported her dream, knowing how important it was. William, at 20, did eventually leave to see the world as he had always wanted. He wrote letters from San Francisco, New York, and even from a ship headed to Europe. Zelda worried about him constantly, but Frank reminded her that young men needed to find their own paths. Sarah, now 15, showed signs of inheriting her mother's love of cooking and her father's head for business. She talked about opening a restaurant someday, combining both passions. As the new century dawned in 1900, Zelda and Frank sat on their porch and looked out at the ranch they had built together. 21 years of marriage, 4 children raised or raising, and a legacy that would continue after they were gone. "You have any regrets?" Frank asked, taking her hand in his. Zelda thought about it seriously. "Not a single one. Well, maybe I wish I had said yes to dancing with you sooner at our wedding party before your shoulder got too tired," he laughed. "I can still dance with you now." He stood and pulled her to her feet, and there on the porch under the stars, they danced to music only they could hear. "I love you, Zelda Calloway," Frank said. "From that first moment in the store, through every day since, and for every day to come. I love you too, Frank. You saved my life that day in more ways than one." "We saved each other," he corrected. "That is what love does." In 1905, Margaret returned from her studies as Dr. Margaret Calloway, one of the first female veterinarians in the country. She set up practice in Montana City and became renowned throughout the region. She eventually married a fellow veterinarian she had met in Chicago, and they built a life together that balanced both their careers and their shared love of animals. William came home in 1906 after 7 years abroad, finally ready to settle down. He had seen the world and decided Montana was where he wanted to be. He married a schoolteacher from town and started a horse breeding operation on Calloway land, specializing in ranch horses known for their intelligence and stamina. Sarah did open her restaurant in Montana City in 1908, and it became the finest dining establishment in 3 counties. She married the local banker's son, and they had 5 children who kept the restaurant a family affair. James and his wife had 6 children of their own, and the ranch house echoed with the laughter of grandchildren. Frank built them a bigger home, and Zelda delighted in baking cookies and telling stories to the next generation. As 1910 approached, Frank was 62 and Zelda was 54. They had slowed down considerably, leaving most of the ranch work to James and the hands, but they still rose early and went to bed late, habits too ingrained to break. They took long walks together when the weather permitted, and spent evenings sitting by the fire, reading aloud to each other, or just enjoying the comfortable silence of long companionship. One spring morning in 1911, Zelda woke to find Frank already awake, watching her with a soft smile on his weathered face. "What are you looking at?" she asked, self-conscious about her graying hair and the lines on her face. "The most beautiful woman I have ever known," he said simply. "Do you realize we have been married for 32 years, known each other for 33? Has it been that long?" She touched his face, tracing the familiar features. "It feels like yesterday and forever ago at the same time. I have loved every moment of it. Every single day with you has been a gift." He took her hand and kissed her palm. "Even the hard days, the times we struggled or worried or fought, all of it was worth it because we were together." Tears pricked her eyes. "You always know exactly what to say. I've had a lot of practice." He pulled her close, and they lay there in the early morning light, holding each other and counting their blessings. They celebrated their 35th anniversary in 1914 with all 4 of their children, their spouses, and their 18 grandchildren gathered at the ranch. It was chaos and noise and laughter, everything a celebration should be. Frank gave a toast that had everyone tearing up, talking about how a simple act of kindness in a general store had changed the entire course of his life. "I was just a drifter with some money in my pocket, and nowhere particular to be," he said, looking at Zelda with love shining in his eyes. "And then I saw this young woman counting coins with such dignity and determination that I knew I had to help, even in some small way. I never imagined that small gesture would lead to this, to a life richer than I ever dreamed possible. Zelda, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that I walked into that store at exactly the right moment." Zelda stood and kissed him in front of everyone, not caring that their children groaned good-naturedly or that the grandchildren giggled. "And I thank God that you did," she said. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I have loved you more with every passing year." The party lasted well into the night, and Zelda stood on the porch at one point, watching her family dancing and talking and celebrating. Frank came up beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We did good, didn't we?" he said quietly. "We did better than good. We built something beautiful. We built it together. That is the important part." As the years continued, they settled into the rhythms of old age with grace. Frank's joints ached on cold mornings, and Zelda's eyesight was not what it used to be, but they still found joy in each day. They took pride in watching their grandchildren grow and start families of their own. James's oldest son took over as ranch foreman, proving himself as capable as his father and grandfather. In the spring of 1920, Frank fell ill with pneumonia. Zelda nursed him through it with the same fierce determination she had shown that day in the general store counting her last coins. She refused to leave his side, sleeping in a chair beside their bed and forcing him to eat even when he had no appetite. "You are not allowed to leave me yet," she told him firmly when his fever spiked. "We made a deal, remember? We are in this together until the very end." "I remember," he whispered, his hand finding hers. "Together." He pulled through, though it took weeks for him to regain his strength. The doctor warned them that Frank's lungs were weakened, and they needed to be careful, especially during the harsh Montana winters. So they started spending winters in the main ranch house with James's family, surrounded by warmth and company and the noise of great-grandchildren who had started to arrive. On a warm summer evening in 1925, Frank and Zelda celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The ranch threw a massive party with people coming from all over the state to celebrate the couple who had become something of a legend in the region. The local newspaper even sent a reporter to write their story. Frank, now 77 but still clear-eyed and steady, told the reporter about paying for a stranger's groceries and how it had changed his life. "Zelda, at 69 and still beautiful in Frank's eyes, talked about counting her last 7 coins and thinking she had reached the end of hope, only to discover it was the beginning of everything. "The best advice I can give," Frank told the young reporter, "is to be kind when you can, to work hard, and to appreciate what you have. And when you find someone worth loving, you hold on tight and never let go." Zelda added, "And remember that the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. I was at my lowest point when Frank walked into my life. If I had given up the day before, I would have missed everything that mattered." The article ran with a photograph of them sitting on their porch, holding hands and smiling at each other with the love and affection of half a century together. It was titled, "From 7 Coins to 50 Years, a Montana Love Story." As they grew older, their world became smaller but no less rich. They spent most days on the ranch, watching the changing seasons and the continuation of the legacy they had built. They told stories to their great-grandchildren about the old days, about blizzards and droughts and cattle drives, about building a life from nothing but hard work and love. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1929, just shy of his 81st birthday. Zelda woke to find him still holding her hand, and though her heart broke at the loss, there was also peace in knowing he had not suffered. They had been married for 54 years, together for 55, and not a single day had been wasted. The funeral brought together 5 generations of Callaways and friends from across the state. Person after person told stories about Frank's kindness, his integrity, his quiet strength. Zelda sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and knew that Frank's legacy would live on in all of them. She lived another 8 years after Frank's passing, spending her time with family and tending the garden she still loved. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already had the love of her life and did not need another. On sunny days, she sat on the porch where she and Frank had spent so many evenings, and sometimes she could almost feel him beside her, hear his voice in the wind. Zelda passed away in her sleep on a spring morning in 1937 at the age of 81, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers from her garden. Her family buried her next to Frank on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under a sky as vast and blue as the Montana they had both loved. On their shared headstone, their children inscribed, "Frank and Zelda Calloway." Together they built a legacy of love, hard work, and family. May they rest in the peace they earned. Below that was a smaller inscription that Zelda had requested in her will. It started with 7 coins and a kind stranger. It became everything. The ranch continued to prosper for generations, passed down through the Calloway family, and always remembered as a testament to what 2 people could build when they worked together with love and determination. In Montana City, the story of Frank paying for Zelda's groceries became local legend, told and retold as an example of how small acts of kindness could change the course of lives. And somewhere in heaven, 2 souls who had found each other in a dusty general store walked hand in hand through endless Montana skies, their love story complete and perfect, a romance that had lasted not just a lifetime but into eternity. Their great-great-grandchildren still worked the Calloway Ranch in the 21st century, carrying on traditions started by a cowboy who saw a woman in need and chose kindness, and a woman who had the courage to accept help and the strength to build a life from almost nothing. The land remembered them in every fence post Frank had set, and every flower that bloomed from seeds Zelda had planted. Their story lived on in every family gathering, every lesson passed from generation to generation about integrity, hard work, and the transformative power of love. Because in the end, What started as a simple transaction in a Montana general store in 1878 became a love story for the ages, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the most ordinary moments, and that true love, once found, can build empires from dust and create legacies that outlast mortality itself.